shut it down. It's just that the only way Trump can shut it down is to surrender, to admit defeat. That's the point you and I have made on numerous occasions. There's no way we can rescue the situation. When you look at what's happened in this war, it is an unequivocal defeat for the United States. I could go through this and lay out all the reasons that this is an unequivocal defeat. This is going to go down in the history books as the greatest foreign policy blunder that the United States has ever made. The Iraq War in 2003 now occupies that place in the historical record, but this one will easily supplant the Iraq War. This is a historical blunder of
I would imagine that's because the Iraq War, as bad as it was, it didn't have any ramifications elsewhere. This one, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying because of the global implications it's already having. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just go back to our discussion of what we've done to the alliance structure that we had constructed in the Gulf, and then marry that to what we're talking about regarding the international economy and the fact that we're heading for the precipice. And you want to remember, at least in the Iraq War, we had some early successes so that George W. Bush could land on the carrier and declare mission accomplished. We've never even had that luxury in this war. This war is just a colossal disaster. And Trump doesn't want to say, I lost or we lost, and let's sign a deal that favors Iran. He doesn't want to do that. He thinks that maybe he can bring the Iranians to their knees and get them to surrender. So he won't quit at this moment. But of course, all that means is that the situation in the global economy gets worse and worse, and his political situation inside the United States begins to deteriorate. So this is just a disaster, and the only way out of it is to quit.
Well, and as I mentioned last night, we'll see if it was coordinated or not, but Senator Kennedy was floating the idea that, well, we could walk away tomorrow. He literally said that. We could walk away tomorrow and we would be a big winner. That's one. But now that this is on Trump's Truth Social, it's about 12 hours ago, the storm is coming and nothing can stop what is coming. Not sure what that's all about, but given the fact that came out around the same time as the piece that came out that said that there were 3 military options they were considering, doesn't give you a lot of warm and fuzzies, shall we say.
The storm is coming, but
yeah,
which storm President Trump is anticipating? I think he's engaged in wishful thinking, as are most of his advisors. And people on Fox News and people like Brad Stevens at the New York Times, then they're just hoping that a miracle happens. And as you and I know, in warfare, miracles never happen.
They just don't happen. All right, well, let's shift on. You talk about the alliance structure and how we've messed that up in both Asia and in the Middle East. Well, Europe is not special. There are also some problems here. You see, the Iran war affects Europe. Is a recession already unfolding? These are some of the European headlines. Inflation hits 3% in Europe as Iran war spreads its oil shock. And then there's this issue here with Friedrich Merz. He says that a couple of days ago, he very publicly said that the United States has been humiliated and we don't even have a strategy. And he brought up the Iran war. He brought up the Afghanistan war. And then the next day, Trump announces that he threatens U.S. troop cuts in Germany. And actually, this is, I'll just talk about this here. This is on his Truth Social just 3 hours ago. He says the chancellor of Germany should spend more time on ending the war with Russia-Ukraine, where he has been totally ineffective, and fixing his broken country, especially immigration and energy, and less time on interfering with those that are getting rid of the Iran nuclear threat, thereby making the world, including Germany, a safer place. So how are we doing in Europe?
Well, Europe is different than the Gulf, at least, and East Asia in the sense that our alliance structure in Europe was on the ropes even before February 28th. Remember, we talked about what February 27th looked like in the Gulf, and you could use the same logic in East Asia. Everything looked pretty good on February 27th. And then on February 28th, everything went to hell in the Gulf and in East Asia as well. With regard to Europe, relations between the United States and its European allies were in terrible shape on February 27th. There was just no question about that. But what's happened since February 28th is another huge blow to transatlantic relations. You just put some of the evidence of that up on the screen. Again, to go back to the economic issue, which cannot be underestimated, what has been hitting hard in East Asia is now beginning to hit hard in Europe. And this is especially true in Britain. I read a number of pieces yesterday and today about how this economic crisis that's a result of the Iran war is beginning to play out in Britain. And the British economy is in real trouble, more so than the other economies. And those other European economies are in trouble, in part because of the Ukraine war. So the Ukraine war did serious damage to those European economies. And now you have the Iran war on top of that doing even more damage. And at the same time, political relations between the Europeans and the Americans, or I should say between European leaders and President Trump, have seriously deteriorated. You talked about what's happening with Chancellor Merz in Germany. It's also the case that Trump has just gotten into a fight with Giorgia Meloni, who is the leader of Italy. And she just gave a speech castigating Trump after Trump had castigated her. So you see that, relations.
And what did she say? I actually had not seen her comments.
Well, she was talking about morality and what is morally right and what is morally wrong. And she was making the case that Trump want to describe all sorts of leaders around the world as morally bankrupt and not willing to do the right thing. And she explained in considerable detail how that was not true. And it was really Trump who was the bad guy when it comes to acting in morally correct ways. People should go out of their way to make sure they look at Meloni's comments.
Yeah, I definitely will.
About Trump. They are more hard hitting than Merz's comments.
Wow, that's saying a lot.
Yeah,
because it was pretty straightforward there. And Keir Starmer here, about 2 or 3 days ago, was interviewed. He didn't take a shot straight at Trump, but he did say, because of this war here, we may have to do fuel rationing. We may have problem with food supply here coming up. So he's already given this public warning. So do you see that continuing to spread throughout, especially if this doesn't get resolved one way or the other? Is that going to spread in Europe? And what impact could that have between transatlantic relationship?
Well, a couple points. You want to, number one, remember Trump has 8 more months in office. We know how much damage he's done in 1 year and 4 months. Can you imagine what this is going to look like when he finally leaves office after 2 years and 8 months from today? That's point number one. Point number two is that somebody has to be blamed for all these fiascos. Somebody is eventually going to have to be blamed for the fiasco in Ukraine, because it's manifestly clear now that Ukraine and Europe have lost the war. The only interesting question is what the final defeat looks like. Ukraine's not going to recover any of its lost territory. It's going to end up as a dysfunctional rump state. And the only interesting question is how much territory it'll end up losing. And then the question is, who's going to be blamed for that? And who's going to be blamed for losing the Iran war? It's not going to be Donald Trump. In Donald Trump's mind, it's going to be somebody else. He's going to blame the Europeans for not helping to open the strait. He's going to make the argument that if we had opened the strait with European help, we would have won the war. We didn't open the strait, and that's because the Europeans didn't ante up. Therefore, they're responsible, just like they're responsible for losing the Ukraine war. This is just going to further poison relations between the two sides. Furthermore, the Europeans are already in trouble. And given that the Iran war is going to make their economic situation much worse moving forward, the Europeans, without any prompting from President Trump, are going to be very angry at the United States, as they should be, for starting this crazy war against Iran. So it will not only be a case of President Trump saying provocative things about the Europeans and pointing fingers at various European leaders. It will also be the fact that the European publics and European leaders will be disgusted with President Trump and angry at President Trump, not only for blaming them for these disasters, but also because they believe correctly that he's in large part responsible for the disaster in the Gulf.
Yeah, in large part, in whole. Just like we couldn't talk about Asia without talking about China, we can't talk about Europe and not talk about Russia, because there's a number of articles out here recently. Russian roulette, is the Iran war playing into Moscow's hands? Then yesterday, Trump gets on a phone call with Putin, which, according to the Russian readout, was at Putin's initiative. So how do you see that playing out? What are the pros and any cons, if there are those, for the Russian side as a result of this?
Well, the war has worked to Russia's benefit for two reasons. One is that we have taken sanctions off of Russian oil, and they're selling their oil at a higher price in global markets, and that's helping their economy, and therefore it's helping the war effort against Ukraine. And then furthermore, given that we're expending huge numbers of boutique weapons in the war against Iran, and we need those weapons, especially for containing China, that means that the United States is going to give the Ukrainians less and less weaponry. And we're going to be interested in shutting that conflict down. And that too works to Russia's advantage. So I think it's quite clear that the Iran war it works to Russia's advantage. I just don't think there's much question about that. With regard to the telephone call, I would imagine that Putin called up and said that he would do what he can to help settle this, because Putin ultimately has an interest in making sure that the war in Iran comes to an end, even though it's providing certain benefits at this point in time. Given that we live in a global economy, as I was saying before, if the economy tanks, the global economy tanks, that will hurt Russia badly. So I think the Russians do have a long-term or medium-term interest in shutting this war down. And I wouldn't be surprised if Putin told Trump that he would help him do that and help him work around the nuclear issue. But I think in the final analysis, the phone call just doesn't matter very much. Does anybody seriously believe that Trump's going to work anything out with the Russians? We have a rich historical record now. Trump came into office in January 2025. He said he was going to work with the Russians, shut down the war in Ukraine, and we were going to live happily ever after. He's failed, not even come close. He's not even gotten out of the batter's box, much less gotten to first base. Trump is not capable of coming up with any sort of meaningful agreement with the Russians for a variety of reasons, some of which have to do with Trump himself, but others having to do with neoconservative forces in the United States and the European unwillingness to compromise with Russia and Ukraine's unwillingness to end the war and so forth and so on. But the end result is that Trump can talk to Putin until they're both blue in the face. And in the end, it doesn't matter very much.
Now, what do you make of the, let me see if that was on this headline. So the headline there, this is the New York Times. Trump and Putin call for a brief ceasefire in Ukraine. I've seen that on a number of Western media headlines. I've not seen that on any of the Russian readouts of this. That surprised me. Why would Russia, at their initiative, call Trump and ask for a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine when they have been adamantly opposed to that? Or do you think it's even true?
My sense is, I've not looked carefully at it. I've read a number of news stories on it. My sense is it is true, and it had to do with celebrating the defeat of Nazi Germany on May 9th in World War II.
Okay. They tried to do that last year as well.
Yeah, I don't
do a general ceasefire.
This is not a general ceasefire. I mean, as you and I, we haven't talked about this in a long time because the Ukraine issue has been pushed onto the back burner by the Iran war. which we focus on laser-like. But the fact is that the Russians have no interest in a general ceasefire. It'd be counterproductive. And in fact, they're now engaged in launching their spring offensive.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I'm looking now on the Russian media, RIA Novosti. It says, assistant to the president, Yuri Yushakov, said that the head of the state informed his American counterpart about the readiness to declare a truce by Victory Day. So there you have it. You're completely right.
Yeah, that would make sense from the Russian.
But that's you never get that from the headlines. From the headlines, just ceasefire. People thinking that's talking about the war, but it's just for that day.
Well, we were talking earlier on, Danny, about the propaganda war that's taking place between the Iranians on one side and the Americans on the other side. And of course, you have a similar propaganda war taking place between the Russians on one side and the Americans, Ukrainians, and Europeans on the other side. And the biggest problem that we face, in my humble opinion, is that the Western media does not do a good job of trying to sort out what is really going on, but instead operates in ways that just reinforce Western propaganda in both cases, or American propaganda in both cases. The Western media does very little to sort of dig below the surface and tell us exactly what is going on. And instead, you get a distorted picture from the mainstream media of both the Iran conflict and the Ukraine conflict, because the media is basically a megaphone for American elites.
Yeah, that's a real problem. Well, listen, I know your time's running real short here, and just however much time you have left here, if you had to just, I know you don't have a crystal ball because none exists, because no one knows what's in the mind of Donald Trump. But if you had to guess, which way do you think he's going to go? Do you think he's going to take that Axios version of one of the three kinetic operations, or do you think he's going to take the Senator Kennedy version of just walk away and say, y'all figure it out, I'm leaving? Which do you think is going to happen?
Well, I have never believed that we could just leave. I just don't think that's in the cards. The Israelis won't let us do that. And
yeah, you have to figure that. It's not just Trump.
And the lobby here in the United States will not let us do that. We're not leaving. And, I remember during the Vietnam War, I think it was Senator George Aiken, if my memory's correct, from Vermont, who said that we should declare victory and leave. This was in the dark days of that war, and I always thought it was, in a sense, preposterous, because it assumes you can bamboozle people. Let's assume there is no Israel lobby and we walk away and declare victory. Who's going to believe that? Nobody's going to believe that. We lost. It's manifestly apparent to most people now that we lost. And it would certainly be manifestly apparent if we walked away to almost everybody. So I don't think that's a viable strategy. Trump may try to use military force to win this war, because he is desperate. And when leaders are desperate, they sometimes do foolish things. And he may be so desperate that he does use military force. But as you and I have talked about, it's not going to work. I think what's going to happen here is that he's going to continue the blockade. I think in terms of his options for keeping pressure on Iran, the blockade is better than ground forces for sure. And it's better than relaunching the air campaign for sure, in my opinion. So I think he'll keep the blockade on. And that is what he says and his advisors say that they're going to do. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether you think this is going to work and how much time do we have to play this game. My argument is it's not going to work. And at some point, he's going to have to concede defeat, in large part because the damage that will be done to the European and to the American economies, and more generally to the world economy, will be so great that he has no choice. I think that's the only thing that's going to put an end to this war, the threat that the world economy is going to go off a precipice. And with that threat present, I think President Trump will then have to face reality and accept the fact that we've lost. But until then, until the economic pressure builds to the point where he feels forced to end the war, I think what he'll do is he'll stick to the blockade, because I think that is the least bad alternative. He has no good alternative here. I like to talk about militaries having three instruments that they can use: air power, land power, and naval power. He can't use air power. He's tried it. It didn't work, and it'll backfire if he goes down that road. There's no land power option here. We just don't have enough combat troops on the ground. And even if we did, the thought of invading Iran is just out of the question. So he's left with naval power. And I don't think that's going to work. They think it's going to work. So I think they'll stick to naval power for the foreseeable future. They'll stick to the blockade. And then at some point, and who knows when that comes, they'll realize it's not working. And furthermore, the costs to the global economy are just too great to continue. So we'll cut a deal, and there'll be, some effort to declare victory. But I think people like you and I will not allow them to get away with declaring victory.
We definitely won't be silent. No, yeah.
We will remind them what they have done.
We will. Although I will add in, though, I am praying for that outcome of the options, because everything else is going to make it profoundly worse, because Iran is not a passive actor. If we do any version of a kinetic strike, Iran has been pretty unequivocal that they are going to strike the painful targets in the GCC countries and Israel that it has not hit thus far. And I don't see any reason to think that's an empty bluff. So don't find out.
Yeah, and by the way, and shut down the Red Sea.
Yeah, I didn't even talk about that one. Yeah, that would be really the coup de grace. That would be just catastrophic.
Yeah, I mean, as we have said, numerous times, you go up the escalation ladder. There's no question we can inflict a lot of pain on them. We don't want to make light of that. We've already done that. We can do more of it. But that's not going to get them to throw their hands up, number one. And number two, they have a second strike capability. You punch somebody in the face and you want to ask yourself, can that person punch back? And if that person can punch back, can it do more damage to you than you can do to that person? And in this case, they can do one heck of a lot of damage, as you just pointed out.